People's lives, their real lives as opposed to their simple physical existence, being at different times. The real life of Tad Vermont, a young boy who was born and raised in the Ridgeway section of Benjerfield, New Jersey, began in 1960. Two things happened to him that year. The first shaped his life. The second almost ended it. That was the year Tad Vermont was 11. So here we are with Stephen King's 17th novel and the first one he wrote dry. This is not to mean that the themes of addiction and alcoholism will completely disappear from his work, as he has kept touching on them over and over and over and over and over and over again, but now we can tell it was from a different, far more nuanced perspective. And, in the same vein as his last two novels, this one dealt a lot with the process of writing, and what does it mean to be the writer. It was also the first novel he wrote after the demise of his pen name, the late Richard Bachman, and in fact was written precisely because of it. I will talk about Mr. Bachman and his works later. For now, it's enough to say that he was King's pen name for 7 novels, 2 of those published posthumously after the reveal that Bachman and King were one and the same, and that once he was revealed as such, King declared him dead by cancer of the pseudonym, which, well, will come into play as we discuss this novel. Originally published in 1989, The Dark Half is possibly the most autobiographical novel Stephen King has ever written, and given how much parallels we have found between his life and his older books, you can imagine this one is a doozy. It also shows a stronger, more focused writing after the absolute mess that was the plot of the Tommyknockers, which is obviously a side effect of King going dry. It was later adapted into a movie in 1993, starring Timothy Hutton, Michael Rooker, and directed by the amazing legend of horror, George A. Romero. It is also the first novel of what I personally call the Castle Rock final act, as with the novella The Sundog and the novel Needful Things, pretty much closes the book on the town we first came to know during the Dead Zone. But that's not precisely what we are going to talk about today. I'm AdalisaZ, and this time I want to talk to you about 2 writers who couldn't be more different from one another. Tad Vermont writes highly well-regarded literary books, whatever the hell that means, and George Stark writes hard-boiled, violent pulp fiction. What do they have in common? Well, let's get the sparrows flying again, and I will tell you all about The Dark Half. When King was starting to get popular, he decided to write some books with a pseudonym. This name was Richard Bachman, whose books were far more violent and cruel than King's own, and yes, I am including Pet Sematary in this statement. In fact, one of them, Rage, deals with a school shooting and is now completely out of print by King's wishes after the events of Columbine back in 1999, because, well, for once the shooters had the book in their locker, and on the other he didn't feel very comfortable with it. I can't imagine how he feels now. Now, the reason why King liked writing as Bachman was very simple. Originally, he was limited to publish 1 book a year as to not to oversaturate the market as King, and he had far more stories to tell, pretty sure because of the cocaine. He also wanted to know if his books sold because they were good or because he had been lucky. So Bachman books never got a lot of publicity. We will talk about those books later as soon as I figure out where to put them in this analysis series, but what is important here is that in 1985, a bookstore clerk named Stephen Brown made the connection between King and Bachman and wrote to King asking him what should he do. King, very graciously, gave him an interview outing Bachman, and from then on, all reprintings of Bachman books include both King's names and Bachman's cause of death. This happened when King was writing Misery, and of course when he was still doing cocaine and drinking every single alcoholic beverage you could find in Maine. By the time King started actually writing The Dark Half, he was already dry, but his tendency to write his life and his own demons within his books didn't go away with the drugs. Instead, one would say they increased. And I really wonder what Stephen Brown thought when he read this novel. Because if Misery and the Tommyknockers alluded to the fact that writing is, for writers, like life, and being unable to write is pretty much like death, well, the Dark Half says it straight away without any preamble. But once again, I am getting ahead of myself. Talking about King does that to me, and this particular book has a bigger issue than usual, so let me tell you what the Dark Half is about. Thad Beaumont is a literature professor and somewhat known writer thanks to some high literature novels he wrote before his wife had a terrible miscarriage. He also used to have a secret. Besides the novels written under his own name, he also wrote 3 quite successful pulp novels that went on to become bestsellers under the name George Stark. In paper, Thad and George couldn't be more different. Thad is a good husband and father who has never had much as a parking ticket and whose novels are pieces of Americana delving on the nature of men. George has been in jail 3 times, killed at last 1 man, and his books are about a soulless criminal named Alex's Machine and are filled with violence and gore. No one would have ever guessed that they were one and the same until the day that Thad decided to give an interview to People's Magazine, letting the cat out of the bag, and metaphorically, and thanks to a photo taken for the magazine literally, burying George Stark for good. Except, George doesn't want to be dead, and he will kill everyone who conspired to kill him, and then he will teach Thad a lesson about deciding what happens to other people's lives without actually asking them first. Now, it's time for me to be quite honest. This is the one book of King where I shamefully root for the Empire and dislike the main character a lot. And this is not because George Stark is a misunderstood man. To the contrary, the first thing we know about him is his epitaph, not a very nice guy, which is the understatement of the century. George Stark is a violent, cruel man who delights in killing. Sure, he has a somewhat understandable motive, as he is mostly only murdering those who had a direct hand into his death, but in the words of Jake Peralta, cool motive, still murder. Not only that, but in pretty much every death except one, he takes pleasure in the torture and planning of it. And, well, the way in which he kills the guy who forced Thad to come out clean with his secret through a very clumsy attempt at blackmail, that is one of the most graphic deaths King has ever written, and includes not only cutting off the tongue, but also replacing it with lower part of his anatomy that I can't name if I ever want to try and monetize my videos on YouTube. So how come I want him to be triumphant in his roaring road trip of revenge? Well, it goes back to the cool motive, and also the fact that Thad Beaumont is not exactly the best character in the book, spending much of it angry that for some reason, absolutely no one believes that the killer, who happens to have his exact same fingerprints and voice prints, who is killing the people responsible for him having to stop writing bestsellers, even if he claims he wanted to stop, is, in fact, not a crazy fan who thinks he's George Stark or himself, but his actual pseudonym come back to life. I mean, yes, we are used to cops being quite bad at their job in horror movies, but Thad spends very little time considering that perhaps the truth is way too out of the box to be believed without any hard proof. In any case, let's go back to George Stark's motive. He wants to live, but more than that, he wants to write. And that is the whole thing around the Dark Half, where Misery was about a writer who discovered that his best writing came out of wanting to survive, and Tommyknockers about a writer who couldn't write anymore due to addiction and ended up destroying his life. Here we have not one, but 2 writers for whom the act of writing is literally their life. And that is also one of the reasons why I like Stark better than Thad. Whenever Thad thinks about his writing process, despite him loving to write, he insists that it's a hard, ruling process that ends with him far more frustrated than elated. At sometimes, it seems that he hates writing. that when he writes for himself or as himself on a typewriter machine, it could take him hours to start writing even one word, and also he's a little bit too obsessed with what other people will think about his writing. But Stark wrote freely, in a far more natural way, with barrel pencils and without stopping to scratch words. For Stark, at least before the events of the book, it was easy and something that Tad thought he enjoyed. He had more fun writing as Stark, not knowing that Stark was there, than as himself. There's also the little fact that everything Stark does, everything that Stark is actually, comes from Tad in a way. Not Stark's existence by itself, no. King gives us a very esoteric explanation as to why Stark was born in the first place that I think was quite original for its time, and I don't think I have ever seen done quite in the same way since or before that. I'm not going to give you spoilers, but let me just tell you that this is not a case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, nor DAD with an evil alter. George Stark exists independently of Tad's body during the whole novel, even if he was born out of his mind. And it's not a Tad's hallucination. In fact, King goes into great pains to make sure that we, the readers, know that it's impossible for Tad or Tad's body to have committed the murders that he's accused of even before he reveals Stark's physical body and his similarities to Tad. But even as we are told that Stark is an individual who is fighting hard to live on his own, that he's not a figment of Tad's imagination, we're still told that it was Tad the one who wrote Stark's biography, the one who made him a rude, violent man. There is a very, very tiny mention at the beginning of the novel about Tad being also known for his bad temper, but we don't really see that in the body of the plot. He's very clumsy, and for a writer, he's not very quick to realize that his stories sound quite insane, but his anger is very internally directed. He doesn't get angry with other people. And yes, Tad writes and likes to write according to himself. It's his life, of course. But the truth is that he finds it hard, especially without Josh. One of the reasons that we know this is because he only has one book to his name against George's 3. It's not just because he likes the money and praise George novels get him. As many of other early King's writers, he seems to see bestsellers, popular lists as somehow lesser form of writing. But because, as I said, writing as George is far easier for him than writing as himself before he realizes that George is a separate entity. And there is a reason for this, which is uncovered by one character that became quite fast one of King's most popular heroes, despite only appearing properly in 2 novels. Enter Alan Packborn, Castle Rogue's new sheriff. Most of the main action in the Dark Half happens in the town of Ludlow, which we visited before in Pet Cemetery, and as you can see, it hasn't gotten any better. However, the photoshot of George's gravestone, and the first time that Tad wrote as George, and most importantly for this, George's first murder, all happened right in Old Castle Rock, the town we first visited in the Dead Zone. And because of this, the new sheriff, well, new for us, but he's been there for a while, since the previous sheriff died in Cujo, has some interest in the man whose fingerprints were found all over the crime scene. Alec Packborn is a very rational man. He's completely sure that Tad is the killer from the get-go due to very strong evidence against him, but at the same time, once Tad gives him a strong alibi, he backs off and in fact becomes friends with the Beaumonts. This also makes him keep investigating even as George keeps killing in Washington and New York, and thus taking himself out of Alan's jurisdiction. But Alan doesn't let it go. He feels he owes it to George's first victim, a kind, if a bit drunk old man named Hubert Gamach, and to his friendship with Tad. Even at times he finds himself doubting the sanity of him and his wife Liz. And thus, he not only finds George's origin, he can even pinpoint the exact date. George was born when Tad began writing as a child. Because see, All this is to say that writing is a double-edged sword. It's a tool where all humans can put our darkest, most violent impulses to rest without real consequence, record our dreams and hopes so they aren't forgotten, and yes, create whole people out of nowhere that will accompany us to the end of our days. Writing is magic, and our magic wands are pens, pencils, and well, nowadays keyboards. They are not one-shaped, so my metaphor kind of falls apart, but you get it. Pencils, magic wands. And that is a pretty cool idea if you think about it. The Dark Half is a good return to form for King, although he was still exorcising some demons through it as we have seen. It is notorious because of the epilogue. Despite the book being Stad's story, the epilogue is through Alan Pagor's POV. And that makes it feel open-ended because for Tad things are done. He has faced his dark half and come up triumphant somehow, he thinks. But Alan just came out to find out that spooks are true, that people can and will get killed by ghosts of men who were never men, and came out a changed man. It feels as if the story should continue somehow, and it does. Because see, The Dark Half is the first time since The Dark Tower where King wrote connecting books. This is the first part of the downfall of Castle Rogue, as he decided to close the door on that little town that had been a part of his novel since The Dead Zone, and he did it with a bang. It began here, with The Dark Half, continued through the small novella The Sundog, which we will skip, for now, in 4 past midnight, and finally ended in Needful Things, our next book, and the first one in a while where the king doesn't write about, well, writing. But he's still writing about some kind of addiction. But that's a tale for another time. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica, and Ellie Riley, as well as my first supporter Tania Pineda and Amy Sung, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos will not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, with a link on the description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or, if you prefer a one-time offer, at Coffee with just one donation of $3, you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so that the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, you sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. For now, it's time to go back to the normal world. Back to the light. But next time, well, there's a new store in town, and I want to invite you to do some window shopping. I'm pretty sure that you will find something that catches your eye, but be careful. If the shopkeeper offers you a price that is too good to be true, maybe it's not such a hot deal down there at Needful Things.